We're journeying back to a time of iron will and gunpowder justice. A time when a man's worth was measured by the speed of his draw and the weight of his convictions. We've got a story for you tonight. One that's been etched into the very dust of the West itself, a tale of brotherhood, betrayal, and the bloody price of vengeance. It's the story of a gunslinger named Blackstorm, and the sheriff who was once his brother. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the harsh Chihuahua on desert in violent strokes of orange, purple, and blood red. It was a painter's sky, but there was no poetry in it for the lone rider. For 7 years, Jack Rourke had seen nothing but unforgiving landscapes and even more unforgiving men, and this sunset was just another day dying, another night closer to a reckoning. His horse, a powerful, jet-black Mustang he called Shade, plodded onward, its hooves kicking up clouds of osier dust that clung to Jack's long, black duster like a second skin. They called him Blackstorm now, a name earned in blood and whispered in fear from the cantinas of Santa Fe to the gambling dens of San Francisco. It was a name he never wanted, a reputation forged in the fire of a betrayal that had burned away the man he used to be, the man who used to have a brother. The town appeared as a smudge against the darkening plain, a collection of rickety hopes and weathered planks huddled against the vast emptiness. Dust Creek. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. It hadn't changed, not from this distance. It still looked like a place God had forgotten, and only stubborn fools clung to. He'd been one of those fools. He was coming back for the other one. As he drew closer, familiar shapes began to resolve. The two-story facade of the Dust Devil Saloon, the low, solid block of the bank, and the tall, skeletal frame of the church that had been unfinished when he'd left. And there, at the heart of it all, was the sheriff's office. A star glinted on the sign, freshly painted, Clayton's Star. A bitter half-smile touched Jack's lips, hidden in the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Sheriff Clayton. It was almost comical. The boy who'd once been too scared to shoot a rabid dog was now the law in a town that would chew up and spit out anything soft. But Clayton had never really been soft. He'd just been better at hiding the snake inside. Jack didn't ride in like a conquering hero or a vengeful specter. He entered Dust Creek with the quiet, deliberate pace of a man who had all the time in the world, which was a lie. He was running on borrowed time, had been for 7 years. He kept his head down, his gaze sweeping the street from under the brim of his hat. He saw faces he recognized, older, more weathered, etched with the anxieties of frontier life. Old Man Hemlock, the undertaker, was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his parlor, his movements as stiff and dry as the coffins he sold. A few of the saloon girls from the Dust Devil were leaning against the balcony railing, their laughter brittle in the evening air. They looked, but their eyes slid off him, another nameless drifter passing through. Good. Anonymity was a shield. He dismounted in front of the livery stable, the sign creaking a mournful welcome on rusty hinges. A young man, no older than 17, with a face full of freckles and apprehension, came out to meet him. "Mister," the boy said, eyeing Shade with a mixture of awe and fear. "Fine animal." "He is," Jack said, his voice a low gravelly rasp, and used to pleasantries. "He needs a good rub-down, fresh water, and a double ration of oats. The best you have." He flipped the boy a silver dollar. It was more than enough, a gesture meant to buy good service and a short memory. The boy's eyes went wide as he caught it. "Yes, sir." "Right away, sir," he stammered, taking Shade's reins. "Will you be staying long?" "Long enough," Jack replied, turning without another word. The main street of Dust Creek was a theater of quiet desperation. The air was thick with the smell of dust manure, and the faint, greasy scent of cooking from the town's small eatery. Every squeak of a floorboard, every distant clang from the blacksmith's forge, was a sound from his past, a ghost in his ear. He walked with a slight limp, permanent souvenir from a misunderstanding in the New Mexico territory. It didn't slow him down. It just served as a constant reminder of the life he now led, a life where every sunrise was a surprise and every shadow could hold a bullet. His destination was the saloon. It always was. A man could learn more about a town in an hour of listening in a saloon than a week of asking questions. The bat-wing doors of the Dust Devil swung open with a groan, admitting him into a haze of smoke, sweat, and cheap whiskey. The place was half full. A few dusty-looking prospectors were hunched over their drinks at the bar, a table of ranch hands was engaged in a listless game of cards, and the piano in the corner was being played with more enthusiasm than skill. Jack moved to the darkest corner of the room, choosing a table that put his back to the wall and gave him a clear view of the entire saloon, especially the entrance. It was a habit born from survival. He removed his hat, placing it on the table, and ran a hand through his dark, sweat-matted hair. His face, reflected dimly in the grimy mirror behind the bar, was a roadmap of his last 7 years. It was leaner, harder. A jagged scar sliced through his left eyebrow, a testament to a knife fight in a border town cantina. His eyes, once a bright, hopeful blue, were now the color of a winter storm, shadowed with a weariness that went bone deep. A saloon girl, her face painted into a strained caricature of cheerfulness, sauntered over. "What'll it be, stranger?" "Whiskey," he said. "Leave the bottle." She looked him over, her gaze lingering on the worn, bone-handled Colt Peacemaker holstered low on his hip. It was tied down, the mark of a gunfighter. Her professional smile faltered for a second. "Whatever you say, handsome," she said, her voice a little less flirtatious. She returned a moment later, placing a bottle of amber liquid and a semi-clean glass on his table. Jack poured a drink, the whiskey burning a familiar trail down his throat. He didn't drink for the taste or the buzz anymore. He drank to keep the ghosts at bay, the memories that clawed at him in the quiet hours. The memory of a shared childhood, of blood oaths sworn under a starry sky, of a trust so complete it felt unbreakable. The memory of Clayton's face, not twisted in anger or hatred, but etched with a cold, calculating ambition as he stood aside and let the posse take him. "You're a long way from anywhere, friend," a voice said, pulling Jack from his reverie. He looked up. The bartender was polishing a glass, his eyes fixed on Jack's reflection in the mirror. He was a big man, with a bald head and a thick, drooping mustache. He looked like a man who had seen his share of trouble and preferred to stay out of it. "Just passing through," Jack lied. The lie felt foreign on his tongue. He hadn't come all this way just to pass through. "Funny," the bartender grunted. "Most folks who are just passing through don't stare at the sheriff's office like they're planning to burn it down." Jack's hand, which had been resting on the table, moved imperceptibly closer to the butt of his Colt. His gaze sharpened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The bartender held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Easy there. No trouble from me. Just an observation. It's just, you got a look about you. A look I ain't seen since the old days. The days before Sheriff Clayton cleaned this town up." "Cleaned it up?" Jack asked, a dangerous edge to his voice. "That he did," the bartender nodded. "Used to be this town was a haven for every road agent and claim jumper this side of the Rockies. Clayton, he changed all that. Made it a place a decent family could settle. He's a hard man, our sheriff, but he's fair." Fair. The word was a slap in the face. Jack took another long swallow of whiskey, the fire in his gut warring with the cold fury in his heart. Clayton, the pillar of the community, the man who had built his reputation on the ashes of Jack's life. He spent the next hour in that corner, nursing the whiskey, listening. He learned that Clayton was married. Married to Sarah. Sarah Mae Thompson, the girl they had both vied for, the girl who had promised to wait for Jack. The news hit him harder than any bullet. He felt a hollow ache spread through his chest, the ghost of a pain he thought he had long since buried. He learned that Clayton ran the town with an iron fist inside a velvet glove. He had a pair of deputies, young, eager, and utterly loyal to him. The town was prosperous, thanks to a new silver vein discovered in the nearby hills, a discovery that he and Clayton had been on the verge of making 7 years ago. Right before everything went to hell. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture that was uglier than he had even imagined. The betrayal wasn't just about freedom. It was about gold. It was about Sarah. It was about everything. As the night deepened, the saloon grew more crowded and boisterous. A poker game had started, the clinking of chips and muttered curses filling the air. Jack paid it no mind. His focus was singular, a burning coal in the center of his being. He was about to get up, to find a room for the night, and let the anticipation of the next day simmer, when the batwing doors swung open with an authority that silenced the room. 2 men stepped inside. They wore deputy badges that shone under the lamplight. The one in the lead was tall and lanky, with a mean-spirited smirk. The other was shorter, built like a bull, with a dull, brutish look in his eyes. "Evening, folks," the lanky one said, his voice carrying an unearned confidence. His eyes scanned the room, and like a magnet finding steel, they settled on Jack. The deputy sauntered over, his spurs ringing an arrogant rhythm on the wooden floor. "Well, what do we have here? Didn't know we had a new guest in town." Jack didn't answer. He just watched the man, his storm blue eyes cold and blinking. "Cat got your tongue, stranger," the deputy sneered, resting a hand on the butt of his pistol. "The sheriff likes to know who's drinking in his town." "Name?" "Rourke," Jack said, the name dropping into the sudden silence of the saloon like a stone into a deep well. He saw a flicker of recognition or maybe confusion in the deputy's eyes. The name wasn't known here anymore. He was a ghost. "Rourke," the deputy repeated slowly. "Don't know it. You got business in Dust Creek?" "Personal business," Jack said. "Personal business is the sheriff's business." The deputy puffed out his chest. "We don't like trouble here. So, I suggest you finish your drink and ride on out. The desert's a big place. I'm sure it can find a spot for you." Jack slowly raised his glass, his eyes never leaving the deputy's. "I'm not thirsty anymore. And I'm not leaving." The tension in the room crackled. The piano player had stopped playing. The card players had frozen, their hands hovering over their chips. The lanky deputy's smirk vanished, replaced by a flush of anger. "That sounds a lot like you're looking for trouble, Mr. Rourke." "I'm not looking for it," Jack said, placing his glass down with a soft click. He rose slowly from his chair, his full height casting a long shadow in the dim light. He was taller than the deputy, broader in the shoulders. The 7 years of hardship had forged him into something dangerous. "But if trouble finds me, I won't run from it." The deputy's hand tightened on his gun. His partner shifted his weight, his own hand hovering over his holster. The whole saloon held its breath. Jack's gaze flickered from the lanky deputy to his brutish partner and back again. He could see it in their iced mix of fear and foolish pride that got so many men killed. They were Clayton's dogs, sent to sniff him out, to test him. "This is your only warning," the deputy said, his voice a strained whisper. "Get out of town. Now." Jack offered a slow, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a predator's smile, full of grim promise. "You go tell your boss," Jack said, his voice low and clear, each word a hammer blow in the silent room. "You tell Sheriff Clayton that Jack is back, and he's come to collect a debt." He turned his back on them then, a deliberate, calculated insult. It was a gamble, a test of their nerve. He knew they wouldn't shoot a man in the back in a saloon full of witnesses. It wasn't Clayton's style. He preferred his treachery to have the veneer of lawfulness. Jack walked toward the doors, his footsteps echoing the slow, steady beat of a funeral drum. He could feel every eye in the room on his back, could feel the deputy's hatred burning into him. He pushed through the batwing doors and stepped out into the cool night air, the sounds of the saloon slowly returning to life behind him. He stood on the boardwalk, looking across the dusty street at the sheriff's office. A single lamp burned in the window, a solitary beacon in the darkness. Clayton was in there. He knew. The message had been sent. The ghost of Dust Creek had returned, and the storm was coming with him. The long night had just begun. The batwing doors of the Dust Devil Saloon swung shut behind Jack, but the silence he had created lingered for a full 10 seconds before the room dared to breathe again. Deputy Miller stood frozen, his face a mask of indignation and a thin sheen of sweat on his upper lip. The stranger orc had not only defied him but had dismissed him as if he were nothing more than a yapping cur. He had turned his back, an act so contemptuous in this world that it was practically an invitation to a funeral. Miller's hand trembled over the butt of his pistol, the urge to draw and shoot warring with the cold, reptilian certainty in the man's eyes that had promised a death sentence if he tried. "Well, Cobb," the stockier deputy grunted, his knuckles white where he gripped his own gun. "We gonna let him just walk away?" Miller's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of every patron on him, judging him. He was the law, but in that moment, he had been made to look like a boy. He holstered his pistol with a jerky motion. "No, we're not. You keep an eye on this place. I'm going to see the sheriff. Now." He stormed out of the saloon, his long strides eating up the dusty street. The cool night air did little to quell the heat of his humiliation. He didn't just walk to the sheriff's office, he marched, fueled by a righteous anger that was really just a thin cover for fear. He'd seen gunfighters before, men with cold eyes and fast hands, but there was something different about this Rourke. It wasn't just confidence, it was a profound and unsettling lack of anything to lose. The sheriff's office was an island of order in the ramshackle town. The wood was well maintained, the windows clean. Inside, a lamp cast a steady, yellow glow. Sheriff Clayton was sitting at his large oak desk, meticulously reviewing a stack of freight manifests. He looked up as Miller burst in, his calm blue eyes taking in his deputy's agitated state. Clayton was a handsome man in his early 30s, with sandy blonde hair neatly combed and a clean-shaven jaw. He wore the star on a leather vest, but unlike his deputies, he looked more like a businessman than a lawman. He had cultivated an air of sophisticated control, a stark contrast to the raw and tamed land he governed. "What is it, Miller?" Clayton asked, his voice even and controlled. He placed a paperweight on his documents, a deliberate and hurried movement. "Sheriff, there's a stranger in the saloon," Miller panted, leaning against the door frame. "Caused a ruckus. We told him to move along, and he what?" Clayton prompted, his gaze unwavering. "He refused. Said his name was Rourke." "Jack Rourke," Miller said, the name tasting strange in his mouth. He told me to tell you that Jack is back, and that he's come to collect a debt." For the first time since Miller had known him, he saw a crack in Sheriff Clayton's inflappable facade. It was barely perceptibly slight tightening around his eyes, the briefest pause in his breathing. The pen he had been holding slipped from his fingers, rolling silently across the desk. Clayton stared at the spot where the pen had been, his mind 1,000 miles and 7 years away. Jack. The name was a ghost, a phantom limb he had severed long ago but could still feel aching on cold nights. He had convinced himself, through years of meticulous effort, that Jack was dead. Dead in some nameless prison camp in Arizona, or shot down in a border dispute, his body left for the vultures. It was a necessary belief, the foundation upon which he had built his entire life, his position as sheriff, his marriage, his wealth from the Lucky 7 silver mine. He slowly raised his eyes to meet Miller's. "Describe him." "Tall," Miller said, regaining some of his composure. "Dark hair, dark duster. Got a scar through his left eyebrow. And his eyes. Sheriff, they're like chips of ice. He carries an old Colt, bone handle, tied down low. He moves like a wolf." Clayton felt a cold knot form in his stomach. It was him. Every detail matched the man he had betrayed, the man he had loved like a brother. He stood up slowly, walking to the window and staring out into the darkness, his back to his deputy. He saw the town he had built. He saw the lights from the homes of families who felt safe because of him. He saw the reflection of his own face in the glass, the face of a respected, powerful man. And behind that reflection, he saw the ghost. "Did he threaten anyone?" Clayton asked, his voice a low murmur. "He just stood his ground," Miller admitted, feeling foolish. "But the way he said it, Sheriff, collected debt, that's a threat." "Yes," Clayton said softly. "It is." He turned back, his composure restored, the mask of the calm, authoritative sheriff locked back into place. "All right, Miller. Here's what you're going to do. You and Cobb are to maintain your regular patrols. Do not approach him. Do not engage him. I want to know where he goes, where he stays, but you will do it from a distance. Is that understood? He is not to be provoked." Miller was taken aback. "But, Sheriff, he defied us. He insulted the law. He is a dangerous man, Miller. Far more dangerous than you can possibly comprehend," Clayton said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is not a situation that will be resolved by chest thumping in a saloon. This is my concern. You are dismissed." Miller, though confused and still smarting from the insult, knew better than to question a direct order. He nodded stiffly. "Yes, Sheriff." He turned and left, closing the door behind him, leaving Clayton alone in the silent office. Clayton stood motionless for a long time, the freight manifests forgotten on his desk. Jack was back. The impossible had happened. The carefully constructed world he had built over 7 years was suddenly standing on a fault line. He wasn't afraid of a gunfight. He was a proficient shot, and he had the law and 2 deputies on his side. No, what he feared was the truth. The truth was a more dangerous weapon than any Colt peacemaker, and Jack was the only other man alive who knew it. He walked back to his desk, but instead of sitting, he unlocked a small, heavy iron box he kept in the bottom drawer. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst legal deeds and assay reports for the mine, was a small, worn photograph. It showed two young men, barely 20, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning into the sun. They both had the same wild, hopeful look in their eyes. One was blonde and handsome. The other was dark and intense. It was taken the day they'd sworn a blood oath to be brothers, to share everything, 50-50 forever. He picked up the photograph, his thumb tracing the faded image of Jack's face. "You damn fool," he whispered to the ghost in the picture. "Why couldn't you just stay dead?" Meanwhile, Jack found his way to the town's only boarding house, a 2-story building run by a stern-faced widow named Martha. She remembered him. He could see it in the way her eyes widened in recognition before quickly narrowing with suspicion. "Rourke," she said, her voice flat. "Thought you were dead." "Not yet, Martha," Jack replied. "The sheriff runs a quiet town now. We don't have room for trouble. I just need a room," he said, placing $2 on the counter. "For the night." She looked at the coins, then back at his face. She saw the scar, the coldness in his eyes, the way he stood with a coiled stillness that suggested imminent violence. This was not the laughing, reckless boy who had left 7 years ago. This was a man who had been through hell and brought a piece of it back with him. She sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "Room number 4. End of the hall, upstairs. No guns at the dinner table. And if you make a mess, you'll answer to me before you answer to the sheriff." She slid a key across the counter. The room was small and sparse, containing little more than a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a wash basin with a pitcher of water, and a single window that overlooked a back alley. It was perfect. It was anonymous, defensible, and all he needed. He locked the door, something he did by instinct now, and leaned against it, finally allowing a measure of the day's tension to leave his shoulders. He unbuckled his gun belt, the weight of it familiar and comforting, and laid it on the bed. The Colt Peacemaker was an extension of his arm, its bone handle worn smooth by his palm. He had lived and nearly died by this gun more times than he could count. He took out his oilcloth and cleaning kit and began the ritual. It was a meditation, a way to focus his mind. The methodical disassembly, the clean scent of the gun oil, the precise scrape of the rod down the barrel, the satisfying click as the pieces went back together. It was a process of control in a life that had been defined by chaos. As he worked, his mind drifted back, not to the last 7 years of violence and survival, but to the time before, to the single day that had become the focal point of his entire existence. The sun was high and hot, beating down on the rocky hills a few miles east of Dust Creek. The air was filled with the buzz of cicadas and the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of a pickaxe against stone. A younger Jack Rourke, 23 and brimming with restless energy, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty glove. "Anything," he called out. From deeper inside the small, exploratory tunnel they had dug into the hillside, Clayton's voice echoed, "Just more granite and disappointment." "You sure your grandfather's map wasn't just a drunkard's doodle?" Jack grinned, leaning on his shovel. Grandpappy Rourke swore there was a silver lode in these hills thick enough to make a man a king. Said he found traces of it before the Apache ran him off. "Well, so far, all we've found is enough rock to build our own prison," Clayton grumbled, emerging from the tunnel, his handsome face smudged with dirt. Despite the complaint, his eyes shone with the same feverish excitement that fueled Jack. They had been at this for months, pooling every dollar they had, working from dawn until dusk, chasing a dream. They were more than friends, they were blood brothers. Both orphans, they had latched onto each other as boys, navigating the harsh realities of a frontier town together. Jack was the wild one, the dreamer, quick with his fists and quicker with a joke. Clayton was the planner, the thinker, the one who tempered Jack's impulses with caution. They were two halves of a whole. "One more charge," Jack said, holding up a stick of dynamite. "Right there, where that quartz vein runs deep. I've got a feeling, Clay. I can taste it in the air." Clayton looked skeptical but relented with a sigh. "All right, one more. But if we just make a bigger hole full of nothing, we're going to the saloon and you're buying the whiskey until I forget how sore my back is." They set the charge, laid the fuse, and took cover behind a large outcropping of rock. The explosion was a deafening crump that sent a shockwave through the ground and echoed off the surrounding canyons. Dust billowed from the mouth of the tunnel. They waited for it to settle, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Jack was the first one in, holding a lantern high. The blast had widened the end of their tunnel considerably, and there, in the lantern's flickering light, they saw it. It wasn't a subtle trace. It was a thick, unmistakable vein of blue-tinged galena, glittering with the promise of silver. It ran deep into the rock, wider than a man's arm. It was the mother lode. For a moment, they were silent, stunned. Then, a whoop of pure joy erupted from Jack's throat. He grabbed Clayton in a fierce hug, lifting him off the ground. "We did it. You son of a gun, we did it. We're rich." Clayton laughed, a sound of genuine, unadulterated happiness. "I don't believe it. I truly don't believe it." They stared at the vein, their minds racing with the possibilities. A real house for Jack, a law office for Clayton, who had always dreamed of being a man of importance. And for both of them, a future with Sarah. "First thing I'm doing," Jack said, his voice filled with awe, "is buying that plot of land by the creek and building Sarah the biggest house this town has ever seen. She won't have to wait anymore." A shadow briefly crossed Clayton's face at the mention of Sarah, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "We'll be the kings of Dust Creek, Jack." "Kings," Jack agreed, clapping him on the back. Their celebration was cut short by the sound of approaching horses. They exchanged a look of alarm. They hadn't told a soul where they were prospecting. Jack instinctively reached for the pistol tucked into his belt, while Clayton grabbed his rifle. They moved cautiously to the mouth of the tunnel. A posse of 5 men was riding up the canyon. They were led by Silas Kane, a rival prospector with a reputation for being as cruel as he was greedy. Kane had always viewed Jack and Clayton with contempt. "What do they want?" Clayton whispered, his earlier euphoria evaporating into fear. "Nothing good," Jack muttered, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. Kane reined in his horse a few yards from them, a smug look on his face. Well, look what we have here. A couple of claim jumpers." "This is our claim, Kane," Jack said, his voice hard. "We filed the survey markers a month ago. You know that." "Funny," Kane sneered. "Because the claim I filed this morning says this land is mine. And what's more, the sheriff from Blackstone sent me a rider. Seems they're looking for the man who shot Deputy Miller over there last week." Described him perfectly. "Dark hair, quick temper. Sounds a lot like you, Rourke." It was a lie, a complete fabrication. Jack hadn't been to Blackstone in over a year. It was a setup. Kane wanted the claim, and he was using a false charge to get Jack out of the way. "You're a liar, Kane," Jack spat. "Maybe," Kane said with a shrug. "But I've got 5 guns here that say I'm telling the truth, and a hanging judge in Blackstone who'll believe me. Now, you can come along peacefully, or we can haul your corpse back. Your choice." Jack's mind raced. It was 5 against 2. A fight they couldn't win. He looked at Clayton, his blood brother. This was it, the moment of truth. They had sworn an oath. "Together against the world." "Clay," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "On 3. We take Kane first." But Clayton didn't draw his rifle. He was staring at the silver vein, then at Kane, then back at the silver. Jack could see the terrible calculus happening behind his eyes. If Jack was gone hanged or shot claim, the silver, the wealth, it would all belong to one man. Sarah would need comforting. The town would need a hero. "Clay," Jack said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. Clayton slowly lowered his rifle, letting it rest on the ground. He looked at Jack, and his face was a mask of cold, heartbreaking resolve. "Don't be a fool, Jack. You can't win this." The world seemed to slow down. The buzz of the cicadas faded. All Jack could hear was the pounding of his own blood in his ears. The betrayal was so sudden, so absolute, it was like a physical blow. It knocked the air from his lungs, the strength from his limbs. "Clayton." "No," Jack whispered. Kane and his men laughed. "See, your partner's got more sense than you do." 2 of Kane's men dismounted and grabbed Jack's arms, wrenching his pistol from its holster. He didn't fight back. He was paralyzed, his eyes locked on Clayton, searching for any sign that this was a trick, a plan he didn't understand. But there was nothing, only the cold ambition of a stranger wearing his brother's face. As they dragged him away, a prisoner bound for a hangman's noose, he saw Clayton walk over to Kane. He saw them shake hands. He saw Clayton look back at him one last time, not with guilt or remorse, but with the cool, appraising gaze of a man finalizing a business transaction. The click of the reassembled cold peacemaker brought Jack back to the present. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in the cold, dark room, his hands steady but his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had never made it to Blackstone. He had escaped during a flash flood that scattered the posse, taking a bullet in his leg for his trouble. He had spent the next 7 years drifting, surviving, honing himself into a weapon, all for this one purpose: to return to Dust Creek and face the man who had taken his life, his love, and his soul. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping town. Down the street, a light still burned in the sheriff's office. He knew Clayton was in there. He knew he was thinking, planning. Let him hide behind his badge and his bought-and paid-for town. Because Jack Rourke wasn't a boy with a dream anymore. He was Blackstorm. He was a debt collector. And tomorrow, the bill would come due. The lawman and the outlaw, the two boys who had sworn to be brothers, were now set on a collision course. And Jack knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the dust of Dust Creek would soon be drinking blood. The sun rose on a new day in Dust Creek, but it was a different town than the one that had gone to sleep. Attention, as palpable as the desert heat, had settled over its dusty streets. The name Rourke was being whispered over breakfast tables and behind cupped hands in the general store. It was a name that the older residents recalled with a mixture of fondness and apprehension, a name synonymous with wild energy and reckless loyalty. Now, it was the name of the cold-eyed stranger who had faced down the sheriff's deputies and promised a reckoning. Jack spent the day in the shadows, a ghost observing his own past. He didn't seek trouble, he sought understanding. From the cool darkness of an alleyway, he watched the town he had left behind. Clayton had, he had to admit, done more than just pin on a star. A new schoolhouse stood where there had once been a vacant lot, the sounds of children reciting their letters drifting on the breeze. The storefronts on Main Street were freshly painted, and there was a sense of prosperity that had been absent 7 years ago. The Lucky 7 silver mine had clearly been good for Dust Creek. It had been good for everyone except the man who had found it. The sight complicated the simple, pure fury that had driven him for so long. Vengeance against a simple thief was one thing, destroying a thriving community to get to him was another. It was a weight he hadn't anticipated. Mid-morning, he saw her, Sarah. She was stepping out of the mercantile, a basket on her arm. She was no longer the girl with wildflowers in her hair and a perpetually hopeful smile. She was Mrs. Sarah Clayton, the sheriff's wife. She wore a fine blue dress that must have cost a fortune, her hair pinned up in an elegant style that seemed ill-suited for the dusty town. She was beautiful, more so than he remembered, but there was a fragility to her, a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there before. As she walked, her eyes scanned the street, a nervous energy in her movements. Their gazes met for a fleeting second across the dusty expanse. He saw a flash of recognition, of shock, and of what looked like pure terror. She quickly looked away, her pace quickening as she hurried down the street, disappearing into the respectable home that adjoined the sheriff's office. The brief encounter felt like a fresh wound. The terror in her eyes told him more than words ever could. She knew. She had to know. While Jack watched, Clayton worked. The sheriff was a master of perception. He didn't ride through town with his chest puffed out. He walked it, a man of the people. He stopped to speak with the mayor outside the bank, his voice low and reasonable. He visited the bartender at the Dust Devil, sharing a cup of coffee and speaking in concerned tones. The narrative he wove was subtle but effective. This man, Rourke, was a specter from a wilder, more violent past. A man he had known, yes, a friend even, but one who had chosen a dark path. He was a threat to the peace, to the prosperity, to the families they had all worked so hard to protect. Clayton was not just a sheriff, he was the shepherd protecting his flock from the wolf who had returned to the fold. His deputies, Miller and Cobb, were less subtle. They shadowed Jack throughout the day. When he stopped to watch the blacksmith work, they stood across the street, arms crossed, trying to look menacing. When he entered the eatery for a plate of beans, they took a table by the window, their eyes never leaving him. It was a childish attempt at intimidation, and Jack played with them. He would duck into an alleyway only to emerge from the other end a block away, leaving them staring at an empty space. He would pause, look directly at them, and offer a small, unsettling smile before melting into the shadows again. He made them feel clumsy, foolish, and their frustration grew with each passing hour, their anger simmering just below the surface. The town watched this silent dance, and the whispers grew louder. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gray, Jack sought refuge in the one place that felt honest, the livery stable. The smell of hay and horse was clean, simple. There were no lies here. He was currying Shade's coat, the rhythmic motion of the brush a small comfort, when a soft voice from the stable doorway made him freeze. Jack! He didn't need to turn around. He had dreamed of that voice for 7 years, and he had cursed it. He slowly turned, his face an unreadable mask. Sarah stood there, silhouetted against the fading light. She had shed the respectable town dress for a simpler skirt and blouse, a shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. She looked like the girl he remembered, but the fear in her eyes was that of a stranger. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice level. She took a hesitant step inside, the door swinging shut behind her, plunging the stable into a world of shadows and golden shafts of light from the hayloft. "They said you were back." "I didn't believe them. People have been thinking I'm dead for a long time. It's a hard habit to break." "Why are you here?" she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "Jack, whatever you think happened, whatever anger you're holding onto, you have to leave. Please. You'll destroy everything." Jack let out a short, bitter laugh. "Destroy what, Sarah? This peaceful little town built on a stolen dream? Or your comfortable life, built on a lie?" Tears welled in her eyes. "It's not like that, isn't it?" he pressed, taking a step closer. He was no longer the boy she could charm with a smile. The man before her was harder, colder, shaped by a world she couldn't imagine. "I remember a girl who promised to wait. A girl who was going to live with me in a house by the creek. What happened to her?" "She grew up, Jack," Sarah retorted, a flash of defiance in her voice. "You were gone. They said you were a wanted man, that you'd shot a deputy. They were going to hang you. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to believe in me," he said, the words heavy with the weight of 7 years of pain. "You knew me. You know I wasn't a killer. Did you even ask? Or did Clayton's story and a pocket full of silver make it easier to forget?" She flinched as if struck. Her silence was his answer. She had made her choice. Not out of fear, but out of convenience. Clayton offered her security, respectability. Jack had only offered her a dream, and when that dream became a liability, she had let it go. "He takes care of me," she whispered, her gaze falling to the dusty floor. "He takes care of this town. He's a good man. He's a snake, Sarah. And you've been sleeping in his den for so long you've forgotten what the sun looks like," Jack said, his voice laced with a cold finality. He had his answer. The last flickering ember of hope he hadn't even known he was carrying was extinguished. "You should go back to your good man. Tell him his lies are catching up to him." She looked at him one last time, her face a portrait of regret and fear. "Don't do this, Jack. It won't bring back what you lost." She turned and fled, her quiet sobs swallowed by the growing darkness. Jack stood alone in the stables, the only sound the soft nicker of his horse. He felt a profound emptiness. He had come for revenge, but he was discovering that some things, once broken, could never be avenged. And seen, from the shadows of the blacksmith shop across the street, Deputy Miller watched Sarah run from the livery stable, his mean face lit with a triumphant smirk. He had his own report to deliver to the sheriff. The news that his wife had secretly met with Jack hit Clayton like a physical blow. Miller delivered the information with a self-satisfied relish, embellishing the length of the meeting, the intimacy of the shadows in the stable. To Clayton, it was the ultimate betrayal. The foundation of his world's authority, his wealth. His wife was being threatened by the one man he had wronged to get it all. The calm, calculating sheriff began to unravel. Paranoia, fueled by whiskey and a guilty conscience, gnawed at him. He saw Jack's return not just as a quest for revenge, but as a direct assault on his life, his property. And Sarah was at the center of it. He decided he could wait no longer. He had to reassert his dominance, to show the town and Jack himself who was in control. He wouldn't do it with a direct challenge. That was Jack's game. He would use the law, his law, as a weapon. He spent an hour poring over the town's charters until he found it, a dusty, long-forgotten ordinance from the town's founding days, prohibiting the carrying of firearms within town limits without the express consent of the sheriff. It had never been enforced. Until now. He gathered Miller and Cobb. "We're going to disarm him," Clayton announced, his voice tight. "We're going to do it by the book, in the middle of the street, where everyone can see." They found Jack on the main boardwalk, watching the stagecoach arrive. The street was bustling. It was the perfect stage for Clayton's play. "Rourke," Clayton called out, his voice ringing with forced authority. He, Miller, and Cobb advanced, forming a half-circle around Jack, cutting off his escape. The townsfolk stopped, sensing a confrontation. The street fell silent. This was the first time they had faced each other since that day in the hills. 7 years melted away. For a moment, they were just two men, linked by a history of brotherhood and betrayal. "Sheriff," Jack said, his voice calm, his eyes never leaving Clayton's. "I'll have your gun, Rourke," Clayton said, gesturing to the Colt on Jack's hip. "Town Ordinance 7B prohibits the carrying of firearms. You can either hand it over, or I'll take it from you and you'll spend the night in my jail for resisting." Jack didn't move. He looked at Clayton, then at the nervous deputies, then at the faces of the townspeople watching. "That's a funny thing, Sheriff," Jack said, his voice carrying easily in the silence. "I read that ordinance this morning. It was enacted in '68 to deter cattle rustlers. The charter also says it can be suspended by the sheriff in times of public threat. And it says it doesn't apply to lawmen or men who have reason to fear for their lives." He took a deliberate step forward. "Now, you seem to have forgotten to disarm your two boys here. And seeing as how you sent 2 men to try and kill me last night." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The accusation hung in the air, deadly and precise. Clayton's face went white. "That's a lie," Miller blustered, his hand dropping to his gun. "Is it?" Jack asked, his gaze still locked on Clayton. "2 hard cases, not from around here, ambushed me in the alley behind the boarding house. They weren't good enough. You should ask for your money back." Clayton was trapped. Jack had turned his own law against him and exposed his treachery in one clean motion. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, questioning, doubting. If he forced the issue, he would be a tyrant enforcing a selective law. If he backed down, his authority would be shattered. "I am the law here," Clayton said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "A lawman protects the people," Jack countered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "He doesn't hide behind a badge to settle his personal scores. You want my gun, Clayton? You'll have to take it, but you'll have to do it yourself. Not with your laws, and not with your dogs. Man to man." The challenge was absolute. It was a call for the duel he had come for. Clayton stared at Jack, at the cold certainty in his eyes, and he knew he couldn't do it. Not here, not now. He was a planner, a schemer, not a gunfighter. With a venomous glare, Clayton turned away. "This isn't over." "No," Jack agreed softly as Clayton and his deputies pushed their way through the murmuring crowd. "It's just getting started." He had won the confrontation without ever touching his gun. But he had done more than that. He had planted the first seed of doubt in the heart of Dust Creek, and he had watched the first, deep crack appear in the facade of Sheriff Clayton. The public humiliation on Main Street sent Clayton into a spiral. He retreated to his office, the whiskey bottle his only companion. The weight of the star on his chest felt heavier than ever, no longer a symbol of authority but a target. He had built an identity as the man who brought order, but Jack's presence had brought chaos, stripping away the veneer of civility to reveal the violent foundations beneath. His paranoia, now inflamed, turned inward, toward his own home. That night, he confronted Sarah, his words slurred with alcohol and accusation. "You went to him. You ran to him the moment he rode back into town." "I went to ask him to leave, to spare this town from your war," she cried, her own fear finally giving way to anger. "You lied to me. You've been lying to me for 7 years," he roared, grabbing her arm. "Did you love him? Are you still in love with him?" "Love," she spat, wrenching her arm free. "I don't know what that word means anymore. I married security. I married a man who promised me a safe life. But this isn't safety, Clayton. It's a cage built on a grave." The fight ripped open the festering wounds of their marriage, exposing it for what it was, a business arrangement. A partnership of convenience now crumbling under the first real pressure it had ever faced. While Clayton's world was shrinking to the size of a whiskey bottle, Jack's was expanding. He found an unlikely source of information in old man Hemlock, the Undertaker. Hemlock had seen every secret and buried every mistake in Dust Creek for 40 years. He approached Jack as he was tending to shade, his movements slow and deliberate. "Heard the commotion today," Hemlock said, his voice a dry rustle. "That boy, Clayton. He always had more ambition than sense." Jack remained silent, listening. "I remember the day Kane's posse rode you out of here," the Undertaker continued, not looking at Jack but at the distant hills. "Funny thing, I was coming back from a call out west of town. Saw them meet up. Saw Kane pass a heavy saddlebag to your friend Clayton. Didn't look like they were exchanging pleasantries." Hemlock finally turned to look at Jack, his ancient eyes clear and direct. "A man who sells his brother for a bag of gold will sell his soul for a sliver of it. Be careful, son. A cornered snake is the most dangerous kind." The Undertaker's words erased any lingering doubt. This wasn't a spontaneous act of cowardice in the hills. It was a planned, cold-blooded transaction. Clayton hadn't just betrayed him, he had sold him. The knowledge settled in Jack not as a fiery rage, but as a cold, hard certainty. The last vestiges of the brother he had known were gone, replaced by the image of a man counting gold over his soul. Clayton, meanwhile, was trying to project an image of unwavering control. He spent his evenings at the Dust Devil Saloon, not in a dark corner like Jack, but at the main bar, buying rounds for men who would drink his liquor but wouldn't meet his eyes. His laughter was too loud, his temper too short. He snapped at Miller for a misplayed hand of cards and nearly came to blows with a prospector who looked at him the wrong way. The town saw it all. They saw the sheriff, their pillar of stability, cracking under the weight of his own star. The whispers were no longer just about the past. They were about the present, about the man who was supposed to be protecting them unraveling before their very eyes. Sheriff Clayton knew he was losing. He was losing the town's respect, his wife's loyalty, and his own nerve. Jack was dismantling his life without firing a single shot. The law was no longer a shield, it was a cage of his own making. If he was to survive, he would have to abandon it completely. He would have to fight Jack on his own terms, in the dark, with no rules and no witnesses. He sent a coded telegram from the next town over, calling in a marker from his own sordid past, from a time before he had washed himself clean and pinned on a star. 2 days later, 2 men rode into the hills outside Dust Creek. They were not common thugs. They were the kind of men who were hired when a problem needed to be buried deep and forgotten. The Pike brothers, Gage and Tobin, were bounty hunters of the worst sort, more akin to human wolves, who worked for coin and the pleasure of the kill. Clayton met them in a secluded arroyo as the moon rose, the saddlebag of silver he handed them a grim echo of the payment he had received from Kane 7 years prior. "I don't want him brought in. I don't want him run out of town," Clayton instructed, his voice a strained whisper. "I want him gone. No body, no questions. Make it look like he just drifted on." "Cost you extra," Gage, the elder brother, rasped, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Ghosts are hard to kill twice." Jack sensed the shift in the town's atmosphere. The air grew heavy, watchful. He had survived 7 years by trusting his instincts, and they were screaming at him now. That night, he didn't go to his room at the boarding house. Instead, he took a bedroll up to the hayloft of the livery stable, a position that offered a clear view of the alley below and multiple escape routes. He lay in the darkness, his Colt in his hand, and waited. The attack came after midnight, a whisper of movement in the alley. The Pike brothers were professionals. They didn't storm the boarding house. They had tracked him, watched him, and assumed he was in his room. When they found it empty, they began a silent, methodical search. Jack watched from the hayloft as they moved through the shadows below, 2 dark shapes flowing like water. They were armed with knives and garrots, tools of silent death. Tobin went to check the stables while Gage stood watch in the alley. It was the separation Jack had been waiting for. He dropped from the loft as silently as an owl, landing directly behind Gage. Before the bounty hunter could even register the surprise, Jack's arm was around his throat, cutting off his air. Gage was strong, thrashing wildly, but Jack's survival had been earned in countless brutal, desperate fights. He drove the hilt of his Colt into Gage's temple, and the big man crumpled without a sound. Tobin emerged from the stable, sensing something was wrong. He saw his brother on the ground and Jack standing over him. With a snarled curse, he lunged, a long, wicked-looking blade flashing in his hand. This was not a gunfight. It was a close, savage brawl. A dance of death in the dust. Tobin's knife sliced through Jack's sleeve, drawing blood from his forearm. Jack grunted, ignoring the pain, and used his opponent's momentum against him, slamming him into the stable wall. The fight was a flurry of blocks, strikes, and desperate grapples. It ended when Jack managed to get his own knife free, a smaller, more practical blade, and plunged it into Tobin's side. The man gasped, his eyes wide with shock, before sliding down the wall, leaving a dark smear on the wood. Panting, bleeding from his arm, Jack stood over the two dead men. This changed everything. Clayton had tried to have him murdered. The unwritten rules of their conflict, the pretense of a future duel, had been burned away. This was no longer about honor or setting a record straight. It was a simple, brutal equation. One of them had to die. He worked quickly. He dragged the bodies into an empty stall, took their money, and dropped a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey between them. He ripped one of their pockets. It would look like a robbery gone wrong to drifters who killed each other over a bottle and a few dollars. It was a messy story, but in a town on edge, it would be enough to muddy the waters. As he slipped back into the shadows, a trail of his own blood dripping into the dust, he knew the time for waiting was over. The storm had finally broken. The discovery of the two bodies at dawn sent a jolt of fear through Dust Creek. Clayton was the first on the scene, his face a carefully constructed mask of grim duty. He publicly identified the Pike brothers as known outlaws, wanted in the next territory. "This is what happens when men like Rourke bring their world into ours," he declared to the frightened townspeople who had gathered. "Violence breeds violence. He drew these wolves here, and now they're dead in our streets." He was trying to spin the narrative, to paint Jack as a harbinger of death, but his words rang hollow. People saw the desperation in his eyes. They saw the two fresh corpses and connected them not to the quiet stranger, but to the sheriff's escalating conflict. The town wasn't safe. It was a battlefield. The violence was the final straw for Sarah. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that Clayton was responsible. The respectable man she had married was a liar, a thief, and now a murderer. That evening, as he cleaned his gun in their parlor, his hands shaking slightly, she confronted him. "Those men," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "They worked for you." Clayton didn't bother to deny it. He looked up at her, his face haggard. "He left me no choice. He wants to take everything from me. From us." "Us," she laughed, a broken, hollow sound. "There is no us, Clayton. There is only you and the mountain of lies you built for us to live on. Jack was your brother. He was a dead end. A relic," Clayton roared, slamming his fist on the table. "I built this town. I gave you this life." In the heat of his rage and fear, the whole sordid truth came pouring out of him. Deal with Cain, the stolen silver, the years of looking over his shoulder, the sheer terror of Jack's return. He confessed everything, not as a penitent, but as a man justifying his own damnation. Sarah listened, and with every word, she felt the last 7 years of her life dissolving into a shameful illusion. When he was finished, panting and wild-eyed, she simply nodded. "Yes, you certainly did." While he was passed out in a drunken stupor later that night, she moved with quiet purpose. She didn't pack her clothes or jewels. She went to his office. She knew the combination to his iron box. She bypassed the deeds and the money, taking only a small, leather-bound ledger. Inside, Clayton had meticulously, arrogantly, recorded the initial payments from the mine's output, including a large, unexplained disbursement to a holding company owned by Silas Kane. It was the proof, the final nail in the coffin of his lies. She found Jack in the hayloft, tending to the knife wound on his arm. He looked up, his hand instantly go into his coat, but relaxed when he saw it was her. She didn't speak. She just handed him the ledger. "This is the proof," she said. "It shows the payments to Kane. It's everything." He took it, his eyes scanning the neat columns of figures. "Why?" "Because no one else should have to die for his sins," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Not you. Not him. But I know that's not how this will end. When it's over, whatever happens, I'll be gone. I'm leaving on the morning stage. I wanted the truth to have a voice, even if no one is left to hear it. She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. For what it's worth, Jack. I'm sorry. For everything. He listened to her footsteps fade away, the ledger heavy in his hand. It wasn't about the silver anymore. It was about the truth. And tomorrow, at sundown, the truth would finally speak with a voice of thunder. The day of the duel dawned and naturally quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. Shopkeepers didn't open their doors. The usual morning bustle was replaced by an eerie stillness. The citizens of Dust Creek had become spectators in a play they never wished to see, and now, for the final act, they shuttered their windows and barred their doors. In the small room at the boarding house, Jack prepared himself with the focus of a monk. He wasn't cleaning his gun for the fight. He was cleaning it to calm his mind. Each piece of oiled steel was a memory, a part of the journey that had brought him here. He didn't feel the hot fire of vengeance anymore. That had burned out, leaving behind a cold, hollow space. He thought of the laughing boy who had made a blood oath with his friend under a starry sky. He was doing this for that boy, to give his ghost a final, quiet resting place. He strapped on his gun belt, the familiar weight of comfort. He was no longer Jack Rourke, the prospector, or Blackstorm, the gunslinger. He was simply an ending. Across town, in the sheriff's office, Clayton prepared in a different way. He was drowning his fear in whiskey. The bottle was half empty, but the liquor did little to steady his shaking hands. He looked at his reflection in the window and saw a stranger staring back, a pale, haunted man whose star was tarnished with shame. He knew he couldn't outdraw Jack. Jack had been born with a gun in his hand. Clayton had merely learned to use one. His only hope was to cheat. He called in Miller, his last loyal doc. "You'll be on the roof of the Mercantile," he slurred, pointing a trembling finger. "When he steps into the square, you take him. A clean shot. No one will question it." An outlaw resisting arrest. Miller hesitated, the thought of shooting a man in the back, even this man, turning his stomach. "Sheriff, maybe we should just let him go." "You'll do as I say, deputy," Clayton roared, his face contorted. "Or I'll have your badge and run you out of this town on a rail." Miller, trapped by his loyalty and fear, gave a stiff, miserable nod and slipped out the back door. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in hues of orange and blood, Jack stepped out onto the boardwalk. The long walk began. Main Street was utterly deserted, a corridor of silent, watching windows. The only sound was the crunch of his boots in the thick dust and the lonely whistle of the wind stirring the tumbleweeds. It felt like he was walking through a graveyard, and in a way, he was. He was walking toward the grave of his youth, of his brotherhood, of the man he might have been. Each step was heavy, final. The town square was bathed in the dying light of the sun, which cast long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the dust. Clayton stood waiting in the center, a solitary figure trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. His face was slick with sweat, his knuckles white where he gripped the handles of his pistols. Jack stopped 30 paces from him, the setting sun at his back, cloaking him in shadow. The two men stared at each other across an expanse of dust and 7 years of hatred. "It's over, Clayton," Jack said, his voice carrying in the profound silence. "I know everything." He held up the ledger. "I know about the deal you made with Kane. I know you hired the Pike brothers. This town knows. There's nowhere left for you to hide." Clayton's face switched. The last of his defenses had been stripped away. He was naked now, exposed as a fraud and a murderer. You never should have come back," he stammered, his bravado crumbling into raw fear. "I should never have left," Jack replied. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. The wind died down. The world seemed to stop. Then, Jack saw it. A flicker of movement. A glint of sunlight off something metal from the roof of the Mercantile. Miller. The final betrayal. In that infinitesimal sliver of a second, the universe compressed. Clayton, seeing Jack's eyes shift, thought it was his chance. He clawed for his gun, a clumsy, desperate motion. But Jack was already moving. He was a force of nature, a blur of practiced, lethal grace. His hand swept down, the cold peacemaker appearing in it as if by magic. The sound of the hammer being cocked was like the crack of doom. The first shot was not for Clayton. It was an impossible, instinctive act of physics and fury. The gun bucked in Jack's hand, and 200 feet away, on the roof of the mercantile, the bullet slammed into the rifle stock just as Miller pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, splintering the sign of the sheriff's office harmlessly. Jack's second shot was for his brother. It came a heartbeat after the first, the sound of the two reports almost blending into one. The bullet crossed the 30 paces of dust and struck Clayton squarely in the chest, right over the tin star. The impact threw Clayton backward. He staggered, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his vest, then up at Jack. He opened his mouth, but only a choked gurgle came out. He crumpled to the ground, his life seeping into the dust of the town he had stolen. Jack stood over him, the smoke from his colt curling in the twilight air. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast, aching emptiness. He looked down at the man who had been his brother, a man now silenced forever. He let the ledger fall from his hand, its pages fluttering open in the dust next to Clayton's body for the town to find and read the truth. Without a backward glance, he turned and walked away. He walked past the silent, watching windows, past the sheriff's office with its broken sign, and to the livery stable. Minutes later, Jack Blackstorm Rourke rode out of Dust Creek on his black horse, Shade. He didn't look back. He rode east, toward the rising moon, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent desert. He had come seeking vengeance and had found only ghosts. He had stood as the victor, but had lost everything all the same. Law and Outlaw were both dead, buried in the same grave. All that was left was the man riding into the night, forever swallowed by the sands, his past a ghost that would ride with him until the end of his days. The final image was of the tin star, lying in the dark, blood-soaked dust of the town square, its shine extinguished under the cold and blinking stars of the Wild West.